Welcome back to Understanding Human Anatomy and Arteries of the Upper Extremity, Part 3. In the last video, we ended with the brachial artery bifurcating into two arteries, the radial and ulnar arteries. Let me begin by sketching in the radial and ulnar arteries. And what I'll do is put a little bit of the brachial artery here, just the stub of it. And then we'll draw in the radial artery. And then the ulnar artery. And I'm making these bow quite a bit more than they would in reality to give us a little bit more space to fill things in. And we'll do the quick fill in. And just so we keep which artery is which straight, let me put an R on the radial artery and a U on the ulnar artery. First, let's look at the radial artery. And I say first because it's the one with the least number of branches, so it's a little bit easier to tackle. And the radial artery has one principal branch near its proximal end. Now when I say one principal branch, I'm not talking about the many muscular branches, but one principal branch that is named. And that is the radial recurrent artery. Let me sketch it in over here. The radial recurrent artery. Now, whenever you see the name recurrent, it means it's a vessel or a nerve that goes back from the direction that it came. So blood is flowing through the radial artery this way. The radial recurrent branches off the radial artery and turns superiorly and runs superiorly. The radial recurrent artery. And it will be an artery that, among other things, will help supply the superficial extensors that originate from the lateral epicondyle. Then when we get down to the distal end of the radial artery, what we'll find is that there is a branch that goes to the superficial arch. And that branch is called the superficial palmar branch. The superficial palmar branch. The remainder of the radial artery forms the deep palmar arch. And we'll color that in. And I'll draw a line to it like so. So the deep palmar arch originates primarily from the radial artery, but the radial artery gives off a superficial palmar branch, and that superficial palmar branch will go to the superficial palmar arch. Now, the ulnar artery. The ulnar artery has two branches. One slightly more superior in origin than the other one. And the superior one is the anterior ulnar recurrent artery. Let me draw those two arteries in over here on the other diagram. We have the anterior ulnar recurrent. The other one is the posterior ulnar recurrent. Let me draw a line to it. And then we have the posterior ulnar recurrent. And we'll draw a line to this one. And these two arteries pass anterior to the medial epicondyle and posterior to the medial epicondyle, respectively. And they help supply the superficial flexors of the forearm, which originate from the medial epicondyle. Now, there is a artery that branches off the lateral side of ulnar, so it branches into the area between the ulnar and radial arteries. And that is called the common interosseous. It, in turn, divides into an anterior interosseous, which runs on the anterior surface of the interosseous membrane, and a posterior interosseous, which runs on the posterior surface of the interosseous membrane. And the posterior interosseous gives off a branch that passes posteriorly and superiorly the interosseous recurrent. So let me get these drawn in over here. And then we'll put some labels on them. The first, which is the branch from the ulnar, is the common interosseous. Common interosseous artery. And it divides into an anterior interosseous artery, and the other artery that the common divides into is the posterior. Draw a line to it. Now, as I said, the anterior and posterior interosseous arteries run on the anterior and posterior surfaces of the interosseous membrane, respectively. They are important arteries for supplying the deep flexors and deep extensors of the forearm. So the posterior interosseous artery will supply the deep extensors. The anterior interosseous artery will supply the deep flexors. The other branch that I haven't put a label to yet, I'm going to write the label on the opposite side here. This is the interosseous recurrent. interosseous recurrent artery. And let me draw a line to it here. And the interosseous recurrent passes posteriorly to the posterior compartment, and it ascends up into the arm. Now, at the distal end, the ulnar artery has a deep palmar branch I'm going to draw a little line in here to show the approximate junction between the deep palmar branch and the deep palmar arch. And then I'll color that in like so. And this is the superficial palmar arch. So superficial palmar arch here, and the deep palmar branch would be this short artery here that connects to the deep palmar arch. And like I did for the deep arch, I'll draw a black line in here to show where the superficial branch from the radial artery meets the superficial arch. So the superficial palmar arch is a continuation of the ulnar artery. The deep palmar arch is a continuation of the radial artery. The ulnar artery has a branch, the deep palmar branch, that runs end-to-end anastomoses with the deep palmar arch. And the radial artery has a superficial palmar branch which end-to-end anastomoses with the superficial palmar arch. So that these two arteries, the radial and ulnar arteries, are connected together distally. And that connection is redundant. There are two connections between these two arteries. That concludes the discussion of the radial and ulnar arteries and their termination into a deep and superficial palmar arch. In the next video, we'll discuss the arteries of the hand. Thank you for your attention.